Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait for participants to continue joining for a little bit before we get started. Welcome to the final day of our 4-part webinar series on storytelling for social and planetary change. This is a series of workshops and it's co-sponsored by the Pachiasana Institute, Counterpoint Navigating Knowledge, the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University, the Religious Studies Department at Florida International University, as well as the Department of English at Florida International University. And we're very grateful for this sponsorship. My name is Whitney Bauman and I'll be the MC for today. If you missed the first 3 parts, there are recordings that can be found on Counterpoint's website, the link for which will be shared in the chat function. These are free and open to the public, but as nonprofit organizations with a lot of volunteer work, we gladly accept donations for our work. So you'll find links in the chat function of Zoom if you are able to and willing and ready to donate to either of any of these organizations. Also, if you have questions, please post them through the Q&A function of Zoom and not in the chat function. You will find links to the chat and the Q&A functions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There will be points of interaction with you, and we might use these functions at different times. But all of the question and answer for any of the panelists or just to bring up issues as part of the conversation, please use the Q&A functions. So first, we're going to have a panel discussion with Q&A from now until about 12:30. At that point, we will take a brief 15-minute break and return at 12:45 for an interactive workshop led by brontë, velez. Would you like to say a little bit about the workshop, brontë?
Yes, good morning. Our workshop this afternoon will be exploring Black feminist prophetic attention. We'll be exploring some soundscapes from my body of work with Led to Life and some practices in embodying prophecy. More to say if you come.
Wonderful, and thank you so much. I can say as having been at the last few workshops, these are really, really interactive and really helpful, and they really are a part of the continuing conversation. So please stay on for that if you're able. So today our focus is on we had an introduction, an introductory webinar, and then we had a webinar on storytelling and knowledge production. And then last week we had storytelling and healing and justice. And this week our focus is on storytelling and re-narrating or retelling. So in order to change the planet, we also need new stories. As Ursula K. Guin argued, one of the things the world needs most right now is more speculative fiction. This genre, though not only this genre, helps us to think outside of our regular narratives and habits of thinking about things that seem out of this world from the present point. So we need people writing such speculative stories. However, we also need people questioning the names of places, peoples, and things. Why do we narrate the present moment as the Anthropocene? Why do we venerate old Confederate slave supporters and the early colonists who helped to commit genocide on and enslave people on the American continents? What type of memorials might help us remember and re-narrate our present in ways that take into account multiple voices, and not just the voices of the colonizing victors? Furthermore, how do we tell more stories that write human beings back into the rest of the planetary community, rather than making human beings the exceptions to the rest of the natural world? These are just some of the guiding issues and questions that came to mind when we were thinking about this project on re-narration. So we're very fortunate to have with us today 3 panelists, and I'll just introduce them all at once here, and then we will move on to the panel discussion. Brontë Velez is a Black Latinx transdisciplinary artist, designer, trickster, and wake-woker, I love all these descriptors, whose eco-social art praxis lives at the intersections of Black feminist placemaking and prophetic community traditions, environmental justice, and death doulaship. They serve as They serve as creative director for Lead to Life Design Collective, educator for ancestral arts, skills, and nature connection at Weaving Earth, and quotidian Black queer life making ever committed to humor and liberation, ever marked by grief at the distance made between us and all life. So thank you for being here. David George Haskell is professor of biology and environmental studies at the University of the South, also known as Sewanee, where he served as chair of biology. His work integrates scientific, literary, and contemplative studies of the natural world. His latest award-winning book, The Song of Trees, Stories from Nature's Great Connectors, examines the many ways that trees and humans are connected. So thank you, George, for being here. Dr. Alex Cornelius is the director of the Center for Women's and Gender Studies here at FIU. She was appointed in 2020, and she will lead the Center and Women's and Gender Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion initiatives at FIU and in the community. Dr. Cornelius joined the Department of History and the African and African Diaspora Studies program in 2006 and was promoted to teaching associate professor in 2019. She earned her PhD in American History from Washington University, St. Louis, after completing an MA in American History at Purdue University and a BA in History at Hunter College, CUNY, New York. Her research and teaching expertise is in race, gender, and science, and African-American women's intellectual history. Her commitment to multidisciplinary research and pedagogy is exemplified in her collaborations with faculty in the Herbert Wertheim College of Medicine, as well as in the Robert Stempel, I'm tripping over my words today, Robert Stempel School of Public Health and Social Work. So thank you, Alex, for being with us. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelists in the order that they were listed on the advertisement for today. So Brontë, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm going to time myself. I'm brontë, velez, they, them. I'm humbled to be here. I'm calling in from unceded Coast Miwok territory, also known as Petaluma, California. It's early on this side. And I am grateful for the many rivers that brought all of us here today. One of those rivers being Daniel Bryan for me, whose program Rehearsing Change in Ecuador had a powerful imprint on my path in life. So it feels like a full circle to be here today. And gratitude to Pajasaina, FIU, and all of the other organizers of this gathering, and grateful to be in conversation with each of you and to learn from each of you. I will open with my vulnerability, which and my gratitude, which I feel like always brings us into a new way to meet one another as strangers and across time and space. I come with deep gratitude for the miracle of life today, as right now marks 24 hours since my granddaddy Jack Pond's transition from the flesh. So I'm humbled to be here while my water table is high and I find myself in the wake of his life, and how holding how much this ableist, racist society failed him as a disabled Black man and as an elder, and as a being who experienced life and spirit in so many dimensions. So I hope to honor the memory of his life and his impact on my life through my offering here today. My grandfather was a Black man who lived with quote unquote schizophrenia. And I say quote unquote, though it might be contentious, because I'm apprehensive to confine his neuroemergence, a reframe that I've heard from one of my friends in reframing neurodivergence to neuroemergence, to schizophrenia, considering that Black folks are disproportionately misdiagnosed with schizophrenia in the US, whereas white folks with the same symptoms are often diagnosed with manic depressive disorder and or given alternative recommendations for treatment. And so I think about how neuroemergence is criminalized, how almost half of the folks who are killed by police in the US annually have a disability. and how that criminalization and violence reflects a society that doesn't prioritize care and wellness, especially for Black people. Um, an article that really impacted my life and my practice was written by a brother who calls himself a Black acupuncturist, Mark Anthony Johnson, who formerly worked as the health and wellness director for a prison abolition org based out of LA called Dignity and Power Now. And in the article, he offers for the language that, quote, Black wellness is the antithesis of state violence, unquote. And so this declaration informs my body of work and practice. I'm asking, how do we ensure that Black folks are well, and how are our environments inherently bound up in that shared wellness? How do we notice what healer and diviner Malidoma Somé has shared, that in Burkina Faso, those who are most unwell in their society are a reflection of a pulse of their collective unwellness or wellness. And those who are most unwell are revered because it's their sensitivity and capacity to feel that shares where we all are or where they all are. And finally, how do we create affect in a world predicated to take our senses away, to numb our intuition, our emotional intelligence, our connection to the earth? And so I practice my commitment to repairing and holding these questions through my work with Led to Life. We're a Black and queer collective that explores the prophetic practice of alchemy as a medium to reimagine justice. And we're asking, how can Black ecofeminist public ritual, grieving, clearing, literally melting weapons together and transforming them into ritual objects and tools to heal and repair ceremony and land, shift our relationship to matter, memory, place, time, and trauma. And I want to share that one of my most linear, quote unquote, coherent conversations with my granddaddy was one about telling me to talk less with my partner so we could be healthier, do less, talk less. And the other was when he said to me last year that it's normal that you want to turn guns into shovels. And there was something about that affirmation of these ritual arts from my grandfather, who's been labeled as sick, that reflected that empowerment, especially for Black, that reflected that empowerment, especially for Black people, actually requires finding it elsewhere and elsewhen. And that we have to create other relationships to space and time, and that we don't have to rely on what has been imagined for us that is actually unreliable. So restoring our world for me comes from the Black feminist prophetic tradition, the practice of speaking your freedom out loud as though it already is, declaring it and feeding that agreement to one another. It comes from Harriet Tubman's audacity to say, quote, my people are free, and then to work from that agreement, to find other sites of power outside of what has been given to you, to find fugitive sites of power. So I want to share a quick story, an image with you all that can kind of bring us into some of that memory. So I'm just going to share my screen for a moment, or what I'm talking about. So this image is, well, let's just take a moment for a moment, because my granddaddy actually passed away yesterday because he couldn't breathe. So I just want to take a moment to find my own breath, and maybe wherever you are to find your breath. And just the miracle of our breath in our lungs, especially in a time that's taking away our breathing, taking away folks' breathing. And so this image is from a ceremony that our collective Led to Life held last year in Oakland, unceded Ohlone territory, Oakland, California. We gathered on January 21st, 2019 to commemorate Dr. King, the radical tradition of Dr. King, in a march co-hosted by Anti-Police Terror Project, a collective that is working towards the demilitarization of police in Oakland, and also holding police terror accountable in Oakland, and creating other measures for safety and other measures and stories for safety and security in Oakland and what that looks like. They hold an annual march called Reclaim the Radical King March. And we close out the march with this ceremony where we melted guns into the constellations, into these molds that were stars, that reflected stars. And they reflected the constellations above, that were above a young Black man, Oscar Grant, who was murdered 10 years prior in the city of Oakland. And we invited our community into this Black feminist prophetic tradition of naming our freedom as though it already was, as though it already is. And so there were community organizers from all over the city and the Bay Area, and mothers who had been directly impacted by the wake of police brutality, inviting us into imagining another world together. And these are all people who are actually doing that in real space and time on the day-to-day, but then to come together and to suspend space and time to feel it. What does it feel like after the police are gone? What does that celebration look like? And how do we start to have that memory already in our body as a way forward? And this image you're seeing is a moment where the santeros were washing a gun before the guns were being brought to the crucible by Black mothers in our community. And they were spitting on these guns and rebuking them with alcohol and washing them. And so I want to take you for a moment. I invite you to close your eyes or keep your eyes soft. I'm only going to play this audio for 2 minutes of it, but you're going to hear Kat Brooks, a co-founder of Anti-Police Terror Project, who 2 minutes before the moment she speaks, she's like, what do I say? And I reminded her that we're saying it as though it is. So you're hearing her in a prophetic moment, channeling. And that will be the close of my comment. So may it transport you to restoring our world today.
Violence in our town, Ashe. I say to you, there is no economic violence in our town, Ashe. I say to you, everybody is housed, Ashe. I say to you, there are no jails or prisons, or as we call them, American concentration camps, Ashe. I say to you that we invest in prevention, not criminalization, Ashe. I say to you that all of our mothers, our fathers, our people, our children have enough to eat, Ashe. I say to you that our children are being educated in the ways of our ancestors, Ashe. I say to you, we no longer rely on outside militarized forces to keep peace in our community, but we keep it for ourselves. Ashe. I say unto you that the generations and generations of trauma from white supremacy and capitalism and imperialism and militarism have been healed. Ashe. I say to you that the people govern each other with laws of justice, equity, and humanity. Ashe. I say to you that we are living in the times that we have spent our lives fighting for. Ashe! 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 And so it is. I love you, Oakland.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Brontë, for this beautiful opening to today's theme. From guns to shovels, the importance of dreams, the individual and collective work that these transformations will take, and the necessary rituals of transformation that are going to help us to get there. It's really beautiful. Thank you. Our next panelist for today is David George Haskell, so I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Maybe we could hold just another moment of at least exterior quiet to feel the breath moving in and out. Thank you. And thank you for gathering us all here today in community through this strange electronic medium here. In these times of isolation and fragmentation, joining together like this is an extraordinary gift. So I offer my thanks to all who, I know many people have worked on this, and I'm very grateful to all of you for what you've done, this welding together of human minds and emotions and spirits. It's an honor to join Brontë, and thank you, Brontë, for your powerful words and for the words of others that you brought to us here today. And Alex, it's an honor to be with you. I'm looking forward to hearing your wisdom and offerings here shortly. I want to say today I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Arapaho on the Front Range of what we now sometimes call Colorado, breathing the smoke of 200,000 acres of forest that have burned in the last just 2 weeks. Some snow has cleared the air a little bit, but every breath unites us human to human. It also unites us to what David Abram calls the modern human world, and the modern human world now, some of it is going back into another state, into the air, into the breath, into the spirit. And I want to acknowledge that that's part of what I'm speaking to you now. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. In my work as a writer and as a storyteller, I've tried to tell stories from the point of view of relationships and not of separate individuals. And this is a perspective that certainly in my own education and in my life immersed in our culture now that I think we need. I think we're in a time where the notion of individuality needs to dissolve, or at least be softened somewhat. Certainly in biology, there has been for at least 150 years, almost as long as that science has existed, this notion that the individual, the self, is the fundamental unit of life. And I think we can now know that that's not the case. It's not the individual organism, species, or gene. It's the interconnections, the relationships, the flows of matter and energy and information among us that sustain us. And in a way that seems sort of a little paradoxical. I mean, I look at my body, so there's a boundary here. This is me, and I'm looking at you, somewhat else. And yet microbiology, that's an illusion from a microbiological perspective, of course, because my body is comprised of hundreds of species of bacteria and fungi and viruses, and you take them away and I'm very sick. I can't function. The I is in fact a living community. The I is a we. So as I'm speaking here, the texture of my consciousness is a product of multiple species interacting together in this thing that for simplicity we give a name, and we even call the name human, and yet it's human plus hundreds of other species that our eyes can't perceive but are real nonetheless. And the same is true for a tree. Inside a tree's leaf are hundreds of species of bacteria and fungi, and that tree's leaf will wither and die without those companions. The tree leaf is a living community. The root, as the root penetrates the soil and interacts with the soil, and the soil is the living dust of the ancestors. And what do we mean by living dust? Well, full of bacteria and fungi that engage in reciprocal symbiotic union with that tree root in ways that we can describe through metaphor and story, but can also be measured now in the laboratory as the flow of chemicals and electrical gradients among these different beings. So when I say the dissolution of the individual and thinking about the limits of the self, in the biological sense, that's what I mean. In a drop of ocean water, there are tens of thousands of cells of bacteria and plankton and so forth. We now know that those plankton, you take a single cell out of that, it does not survive. Why? Because the genes essential for its function are lost. Each cell does what it does best and relies on others in the community to do what they do best. And the interaction among them gives us the living oceans and the living rivers. And so I frame that in terms of genetics, but it's true in terms of ecological flows and the flows through time of DNA from the ancestors and so forth. So even in something as simple as a drop of water, we see that the world is a living community. And so even in the place where we imagine ourselves to be most alone in our thoughts, say have a thought of a tree, well, that thought does not arise from a single nerve cell, it arises from microsecond by microsecond interactions among nerve cells, relationship that produces this seemingly singular thing, which is the thought of a tree, of the mental image, the subjective experience of thinking of a tree. So we live in this many-layered community from consciousness through ecological relationships to our bodily physicality, physical reality. So how to find and tell these stories? Of course, there are many ways. I offer some things that I, in my own life, have found helpful. And the starting point is to realize that every story, whether it's a piece of nonfiction, which is the realm I work in mostly, or fiction, or music, or visual art, every story gains its power by focusing attention, by giving attention to particular strands of interaction and relationship, but also necessarily by excluding others. A single story can't be the whole world. And so to convey a story, whether it's a very simple thing like telling a friend, oh, I went to the grocery store and this happened and that happened. Well, we didn't mention what was in the parking lot or the voices of the birds around us and so forth, because that was not the point of that story. So this isn't this exclusion is necessary, partly because the gift of attention allows other strands of experience to come within us. So it's in a way, it's a paradox. We're giving attention to some things and we're excluding others. And of course, there are dangers and trade-offs in that practice. And the power of stories is to draw other people's attention into places and contexts that we think are worthy of their attention. So in telling a story, we are offering a gift or an invitation, if you like, for other people to come into other ways of knowing, other interactions among different strands of experience. And of course, some of those invitations are accepted and some are not, and that's appropriate. We can't be open to all stories at all times. As individuals and as communities, we have to discern where to direct our attention. But this means that storytelling can be dangerous, because storytellers are not always good story gatherers. And so I ask myself this a lot. Am I conveying my voice only? as I'm offering this story? Has storytelling challenged me to expand my ideas and emotions and connections? Or is it just reinforcing my own preconceptions? And so I hope that in developing my capacity capacities as a storyteller, I'm opening and learning rather than just saying, I've got stuff that other people want to know and here I'm going to tell you about it, which of course we're saturated, particularly in election season, we're saturated in that kind of storytelling. And we know other forms of storytelling in which the storyteller themselves are transformed and opened in some way. And so in my own work, there's a particularly important approach that I take that's important for me, and that is to draw on the methods of contemplative practice. And by that, I mean giving our attention over repeated day in, day out, sometimes over years, to a particular place or set of relationships or ideas. Returning again and again as a form of meditation, if you like, to the nexus of stories that we're trying to tell, to discern first, to hear, to listen, and then to offer to others. So what does that mean in practice? Well, my work has been focused quite strongly around forests and trees and the way that people are related to forests and trees. And so I have, say in the book, The Songs of Trees, I picked a dozen trees in different parts of the world and went back over years repeatedly to each tree to sit with the tree and listen. Quite literally listen. What do I hear in the voice of the wind in the leaves? What can I learn from that? What can I learn from the sounds of the songbirds and the ravens and the other beings in this tree? What do I hear as the seasons are changing? And then when I converse with other people, human people, rather than the bird people or the tree people, and I think we all have personhood in our own way. That's why I use that language. When I'm talking to other humans, listening to how they're relating to the tree. If, say, a market vendor has a stall under the tree and has worked there for years, that person knows this tree and is bound to that tree in ways that I need to listen to and learn from. Talking to agriculturalists and city managers and people passing, say, on a street tree, people who live in that neighborhood, what is their nature of their relationship, known and unknown, to this tree. And the two keys for me have been returning again and again without expectation, because expectation blocks us with preconceptions. For example, a city tree in New York, returning again and again. And I thought, I know what this tree is and what the role of city trees are. And so it's like, no, I don't. I just need to stand or sit with this tree for hours and hours to discern and to listen. And in that process, what I'm trying to do is open my senses. What is the quality of light today? How does it compare to yesterday? What's coming on the wind in terms of aromas, and what might that teach me? What am I hearing? What is the soundscape close by and in concentric circles going outward? And what are maybe some of the sounds coming up from the ground? In the cities, those are very important, from the subways and the rumbles and the vibrations of energy through the city. Putting my hands on the tree surface, what is the texture here? What can the 12 different types of nerve endings in my fingertips teach me about the materiality, the physicality, the life of this tree? And coming again and again with open senses to try to draw the lives of the more than human world back into the human story. Because of course we're made from those connections. Every breath of air that we take is partly made from trees and partly made from ocean plankton. Every bite of food, the temperatures in our neighborhoods, the amount of particulate air pollution around us is a product partly of human action, but also of the other beings, the other beyond human beings that we share our communities with. So and as human beings, we're very much focused on our own stories, as we need to be. There are important stories that we need to listen to there, but we need to also expand out to realize how those stories are partly a product of our connections, whether they're beautiful, joyful connections or broken and unjust connections out into the more than human world. And as I'm doing this, the question in my mind is, as I'm focusing my attention and giving my attention to, say, a particular tree, Whose story is being excluded by that focus? And in what way can I open myself to stories that I need to hear, even though they may not at first be on my radar screen? What stories have my preconceptions, my cultural context, have pushed away so that I don't even know to ask the question of what is excluded here? So there are ways of exclusion we're aware of, but more insidious and more problematic are the ones we don't even know to challenge ourselves with. And again, opening the senses and engaging in conversation with others around a particular place, I think helps us push outward those boundaries of preconceptions. We can never escape them, of course. That's part of what it means to be an embodied human being, but we can challenge ourselves to move beyond them. So talking to people outside of our comfort zones, outside of the circle that our culture has placed us within. And then to do the same with the more than human world. What energies and flows and connections to other beings sustain us in those places, even if those energies and flows and histories have been pushed aside. Where does my water come from when I sip on water? Where does it go? And in whose community is that sewage treatment plant located? And in what river and what fish are swimming in those waters? Where did that particulate pollution come from that I'm breathing? What was the journey of the wheat that I ate in a piece of bread for my breakfast? A story that goes back at least 10,000 years and that connects multiple continents and multiple peoples and the soils and wisdoms of plants of multiple places. And I'll close with this connection and question here. And we're now in October, and where most of us, I think, on this Zoom meeting are in the temperate zone. So what is happening at night when our vision is dimmed by the setting sun? Over us are flying hundreds of millions of songbirds, winging from the great boreal forests of the north down to the subtropics and the tropics. Unseen, unheard, but this great flow of migratory energy is passing over us as we sleep. Part of the community that we're bound up to, because our future too is also bound in the forests of the tropics and the boreal forests and the peoples in particular of those forests whose lands are still to this day being taken from them. So this practice of repeated attention that draws from contemplative practices in various religious traditions, I think can go part way to opening us to some of these stories of the more than human world. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is the first time that I've lived in Berlin on and off for about 5 years. And this is the first sort of fall season that I've noticed at night geese flying over. And maybe it's just because the world's a little bit more quiet right now. Thank you so much for these stories of elemental relationality, from the fires and climate change, the breath in the air, the connection between breath and air, the world and a droplet of water, and the microbiome and the dirt and the earth. This was a very sensual story. So thank you for that. And up next, I hand the floor over to you, Alex. Thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So I'd like to, first of all, thank you, Whitney, so much for having me join this conversation. I also want to thank Rebecca Friedman of the WPHL, Counterpoint, and the Pachasana Institute, the Religious Studies Department, as well as the English Department at FIU, and all of you, my co-panelists. David, thank you so much for your really very stimulating talk. And a special thank you to Brontë for being with us and having the courage to come and join us in spite of the fact that she recently lost her grandfather. Deep appreciation for your presence here with us. And I'm sure your grandfather's presence is here as well. I wanted to begin by talking about or opening our discussion with Kadir Nelson's Say Their Names, because I think that this really brilliant piece of artwork that was featured on the cover of the New Yorker captures a great deal of the sentiment of what we were feeling this summer. So many of us, not only in the United States, but around the world, were deeply affected by the slow death, the slow murder, the anti-prayer that resulted in George Floyd's death, this act of almost nonchalance, kneeling upon the neck with hand in pocket, that was so difficult to watch over and over again this summer, again, in the larger context of the pandemic. And featured here, literally featured within the body of George Floyd, are other victims of violence, including more recent victims such as Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Susan Bland, as well as people whose faces are still familiar to us, including Emmett Till. I think what's also really interesting and captivating here about what the Kadir Nelson offers us is a way for us to deal with the fact that these murders have a historical precedent. And he does have featured toward the bottom of the image the unnamed, what he refers to, the people he refers to as the unnamed enslaved Africans. What we also see are the presence of periwinkle flowers, which was really instructive. And the reason for the periwinkle flowers, the reason for the presence of these really beautiful signs of life, even within the midst of this destruction, is that archaeologists and anthropologists apparently were able to discover that the presence of periwinkle flowers often were associated or were planted near mass graves of enslaved Africans. And so I think what this cover does is shows us the extent to which there are ways in which we are not reading the environment and the stories that our environment are telling us that are not self-evident, so that the presence of these flowers actually are indicative and symbolize our ancestors, the live bodies of our ancestors, and the extent to which they continue to live among us and to share their beauty with us in ways that again are not necessarily self-evident. And so I wonder about other ways in which we can begin to read our environment and to maybe find new ways to re-narrate and recapture our history, to reclaim these legacies. Now, I'm going to, in my talk, begin with a kind of like exploration of the extent to which the desire for speculative fiction, the desire for news stories is really very evident in our popular culture and film and in some of the series that have recently been produced. And then after that, I'm going to talk more specifically about Black feminist queer writers who have engaged in this work. I'll be ending with the work of Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who I think really offers brilliant examples of the ways in which we can write ourselves back into conversation and relationship with the environment, with other life forms, and at the same time also address social justice issues. And the way in which she does it, I think, are not in contradistinction to each other, really complement each other in very powerful ways. Now, in reference to this time period, everyone, we talk about 2020 and how difficult it's been. And certainly, I think la coyuntura is a word that captures some of what many of us have been feeling. So Aurora Levins Morales describes la coyuntura as a phrase in Spanish that was, quote unquote, part of all of the leftist speeches of my youth. La coyuntura, it means the situation, the circumstances, the current historical moment. If the big picture is a constellation of stars by which we plot our course, the coyuntura is the muddy ground we stand on while we stargaze, the bloody, difficult present. And certainly I think many of us do find us in this situation. How do we move out of this bloody, difficult present? How do we move out of this situation that we find ourselves in 2020? I think it's very clear that in our popular culture, there is a call to try to step out of our current situation through speculative fiction. I'm sharing with you now a depiction of the HBO series, The Watchmen. And in The Watchmen, we have masked vigilantes who are trying to root out racist cops within the police force. They also are, many of the actors also are, of the protagonists also are in law enforcement as well. Part of what we see in many of these dramas is the desire to go back in time. Often we also see very strong female leads who go back in time as a means of trying to find knowledge that will not only help them to explain the present, but to move forward. And so jumping out of time, finding this transcendent space seems to be a recurrent theme in many of the fictions that the film production that we see now. Here is another production, pretty much, I think, underappreciated Spike Lee film titled See You Yesterday. And See You Yesterday, again, you see similar imagery, a time machine. We have two protagonists, high school students at New York's Bronx High School of Science, which is a very competitive school that students have to test into. It's set in the 1980s, and you hear the rhythms and music of that time period at the same time. And the students, these young people, have invented a time machine. They go through the time machine, and in doing so, coached by Michael J. Fox, of course, the reference is explicit. They go in the time machine, but they confront racist police officers. And that results in a lethal death. What happens in the film is the very strong, again, female lead keeps trying to go back to try to fix what has happened. And each time she goes back, there's another incident. And so the implicit message is that this amazing scientific knowledge that they have captured cannot protect them from the systemic violence to which people are continually subjected. So kind of in a, to play with Audre Lorde's, your silence will not protect you. In this case, your science will not protect you. Your respectability politics will not protect you. Admission to elite institutions will not protect you. It's very clear that what is the driving force and what we see here is a commitment to community, a commitment to banding together, but also a desire to not necessarily sweep what is the problem, systemic violence, under the rug, even through these amazing acts of courage and scientific knowledge and prowess. Lovecraft Country, again, another film recently produced. Like the first series that I alluded to, Lovecraft Country also offers the protagonist a time machine, a way to go back into the past. I think it's significant that in both Lovecraft Country and in the other, in The Watchmen, they go back to the Tulsa race riots. It's also significant that in all of these tales, you have, again, very strong Black female characters who confront police officers, who go back into the past, commune with people who have knowledge, and bring that knowledge back into the present as a means of moving forward. Now, these the films I just talked to are really very heavy. These are all films that, and series that I watched once and could not watch again, because some of the images, as a historian, for example, in The Watchmen, some of the images that you see of the Tulsa race riots really are images, newspapers and photographs come to life. And so seeing that representation and being subjected to it is in itself, has an impact, I think. And I hate horror, but it seems like the responsible thing to do in terms of having a better sense of what those experiences were. For a lighter version, we have, of course, Black Panther. But in a strange, set of circumstances in which I guess you see life imitating art. We lost Chadwick Bardwick this summer, which was really deeply affecting because it felt like an attack on the dream space. For me, it felt like an attack on the last time Black people in this country had a collective good time. which is when we all got dressed up and went to go see Black Panther. But I think, again, in terms of life imitating art, it's very interesting to me that people are looking forward to the possible resurrection of this character, who is Shuri, who plays Chadwick Boseman's, the Black Panther, T'Challa's younger sister. And Shuri in the film really is the one who possesses, again, immense scientific knowledge. She is a healer. She is very sassy, as we can see from this picture. She has no reverence for some aspects of tradition, right? So the aspects specific to being a princess, but she does value the knowledge of the past. So we see on her person, for example, cowrie shells. We see the Adrinka symbol that symbolizes strength and the power to move forward. And so many people, both in terms of the context of the film and in moving forward, are hoping that this is a character who will continue to grow. Now, moving more toward literature, of course, speculative fiction, science fiction is not something new. Many people turn to Octavia Butler as being, to a certain extent, a mother of Black speculative fiction and Black science fiction writing. Probably her most famous novel until recently was Kindred, which again involves a woman being pulled back into the past during the time of enslavement. But Parable of the Talents, another one of her books, has gotten more recent attention because of the allusions to what some people see as contemporary United States. I believe that the book was published in 1998, but this is a quote out of the book. "The Donner administration has written off science, but a more immediate threat lurks. A violent movement is being whipped up by a new presidential candidate, Andrew Steele Jarrett, a Texas senator and a religious zealot who is running on a platform to make America great again." Now, I think what we should take from this is not necessarily the extent to which Octavia was a seer or could see into the future, but the extent to which some of what we are reacting to now have been with us for a very long time. There have been people who have been calling attention to the ways in which nationalism or anti-science or a lack of respect for the land has been becoming more and more a part of the American story. Turning to, again, contemporary writers, I'm really very fascinated and very much, to a certain extent, proud and very enthusiastic about some of the young writers who are coming out now, and the activists and the energy with which they approach new ways to address issues specific to social justice and new ways to re-narrate the story of who we are and who we could be. Octavia's Brood is a book of short stories edited by Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Imarisha. And they state, "We believe it is our right and responsibility to write ourselves into the future." And so they compiled a book that includes activists, Black Lives Matter activists, and other people. And they have short stories that kind of imagine a world in which they are very much in control or have a say. Adrienne Marie Brown's short story, The River, for example, is a really interesting short story in which there's a party at the mayor's house, and the river rises up and takes kind of like takes over the home of the mayor, and it takes back into its person all of the gentrifiers. So all of the people who were born in the community survive, but none of the gentrifiers do. And so it's a statement, of course, about I guess a dream of how this policy could be handled. But I want to end with a look at Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work. She has a 3-part series, Spill, Black Feminist Frigidity, M Archive, After the End of the World, and Dub, Finding Ceremony. And what's interesting about her work is that she very intentionally also engages the writing of other Black feminists, which is pretty typical of Black feminist writing. There's always intertextuality, but she does so in a way that is really very deliberate and will lead you to the writing of people she considers to be her intellectual mothers. So in Spill, for example, you can read these books on the face of it, but you'll understand Spill better if you read Hortense Spiller's work. You'll understand M. Archive better if you read M. Jackie Alexander's work. And with Dub, Gums is really engaging the work of Sylvia Wynter. So in Dub, Gums writes, it can be dangerous to investigate what our lives depend on, to recognize that freedom requires a species scale betrayal of our founding mythologies. She's really calling us to kind of change the way in which we've always told the story of who we are. She references Wynter, who says, we are not Homo sapiens, we are Homo narrans, not the ones who know, but the ones who tell ourselves that we know. She says we therefore have the capacity to know differently. So where can this lead us? Gums has some ideas. She says, I had to understand that when I reached out for my ancestors, I couldn't, like population geneticists do, just stop at some point of relation that would be marketably salient to my ego's prior understanding of who I am now. My listening began to include speakers who have never been considered human. And while that category of the never considered human tragically includes my enslaved ancestors, my disabled ancestors, my queer and indigenous ancestors, and everyone subject to police radio codes Wynter writes about in No Humans Involved, it also generatively includes whales, corals, barnacles, bacteria, and more, kindred beyond taxonomy. And here, of course, the reference to the No Humans Involved by Sylvia Wynter is a reference to an article in which Wynter exposed the use of NHI, the code NHI, and I guess the LA police used the code NHI to make references to cases involving Black men. So it's kind of like an inside code that systematically dehumanized Black men. NHI were not involved in this case. Gums calls attention to the attempt to dehumanize Black people, but also to think of humanity as being part of a larger system of life and living. She goes on to say, and gives us a kind of a roadmap in terms of the particular project she embarks on in Dub. The project is an artifact and tool for breath retraining and interspecies ancestral listening. It is structured to ask, what if you could breathe like whales who sing underwater and recycle air to sing again before coming up for air? What if you could breathe like coral from a multitude of simultaneous openings into one source built on the bones of all your dead? What then? And by then, I mean now. You will find, especially if you read aloud, but even if you don't, that many of these passages ask of you what my ancestors are asking me. When you think it's time to come up for air, go deeper. When you think your heart will break, stay there, stay with it. But at the same time, when you think you got to hold on to something like who you think you are, let go. I want to end just with this, another example, actually from her first book, Spill, of the extent to which this pathway can also lead to joy, even within the midst of acknowledging the pain, which I think is very much captured by, and I mean, you see this all through Gums's work, really incredible work. But here, I just will close with this reading. Before God bless the child that's got her own, I am the moan, I am the touchstone, I am the divining phone home. I am the handout that stands out, the clarion that shouts we are an ecosystem. When domination wants a name, I am old. Before my sweat is sold, I am gold. I am circular story retold. I am fire, I am root, I am cavernous, ravenous proof. So fly that I perceive the lie, so bright, born the same day as the sky. So just try. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Another great presentation here, and I really appreciate it. So the importance of naming, this idea of slow murder and slow death, and what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. What is named and what is unnamed. This re-narrating the past and the present through reading the environment and taking into account the social injustice issues that are there. Interspecies ancestral listening. I love all of these concepts, and I think that how do we do this? How do we critically reread humans, all humans, into the rest of the natural world, not in a demotive way, but in an uplifting way for our planetary context, with attention to all these isms and the differences in the way that different bodies are treated differently because of color, gender, sex, sexuality, race, and all these sorts of things. So thank you so much. At this time, I want to remind everyone to please put questions in the Q&A function for all of the panelists, who I'll invite back to the conversation now. Please submit those questions in the Q&A function. I wanted to start with my own question from my own perspective, and that is, I mean, all of you, and of course I'm a religious studies professor, so it's going to be about religion. But the talk about dreams and the importance of dreaming, the talk about ancestors, talk about contemplation and connectivity, these sorts of things. I want to just ask all of you, sort of how consciously or unconsciously do religious ideas shape your thinking, and how important do you think some type of religion, whether it's converting old practices to address new problems or coming up with new practices. How important is this, do you think, in terms of restoring and re-narrating? Anyone can start. Brontë, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, well, yeah, theology is so a part of my practice, and I want to cite the work of Lisa Anderson, Black feminist theologian at Auburn Theological Seminary, who's they've been holding an annual circle called Sojourner Truth Leadership Circle. And Lisa talks about, in an amazing interview on the Fortification podcast, about how they were exploring Toni Morrison's text, Beloved, as a theological text and as scripture. And there's a passage where a character named Baby Shugs, a disabled elder, is bringing men and women and everybody in the community and children into this place called the clearing, where she's inviting them into this fugitive space where they can love up on their bodies and care for their bodies and their flesh, which has been made irreverent by enslavement, and to love up on their flesh in this place called the clearing. And so Lisa talks about how their Sojourner Truth Leadership Circle was focused on a theology of clearing and on a public theology of clearing. So I really feel so influenced by, especially with what Alex has brought up about around all of these texts. How do we bring Black feminist texts as new scripture? How do we bring these speculative fiction texts as scripture to inform how we might live out this theology? Really has influenced me, and how to make new theologies with folks in public feels really, important.
Thank you so much. Alex, or?
So that's a really difficult question that I really appreciate, because I was raised Catholic. I long for religious spaces that also are not steeped in patriarchy, homophobia, racism, and so that's navigating that, finding that space in ways that avoid ultimately patriarchal structures as a kind of unifying theme, I find to be really very difficult. And I'm more, you know, I've in the past aligned myself more with like liberation theologists within Catholic communities. In terms of the work, at the same time, I do get kind of nervous when in some of the film, there, you know, God is invoked as a person that for whatever reason that I, you know, I'm a little nervous about the attempt to diminish God or to make it irrelevant or non-existent. So for me, I think I agree with brontë, like the spaces where people are able to commune and invoke a higher spiritual power that also pays attention and is responsive to social justice in a meaningful way in terms of our everyday lives. That doesn't kind of take a, you know, well, the Bible says X, Y, and really kind of like narrow definition of what it means to be in communion with other people. Or that's the work that I always gravitate to. And I think that these new writers are doing that. They do provide a space where people can be spiritual or tap into something outside of their own personal bodies, commune with other people, and have a sense of community that's rooted that also takes into account ancestral lines as well.
Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would echo some of the troubled feelings in that, I mean, particularly in North American culture right now, religion is often aligned with this notion of separation and of human dominance over other beings. And of course, within that, there are all the hierarchies of some humans dominant over others as well. And that's deeply, I think, problematic and toxic to our lives as people together, but also in how we think of ourselves in relation to the other beings, the trees, the oceans, the birds, and so on. And politically, that's a major force, and we see human bodies are bleeding, the earth is bleeding because of that alignment between this notion of what religion is and how scripture should be read and what that means we can do to one another and to the earth. So on the one hand, but on the other, there are traditions like of believing that the earth itself is scripture, that we are co-created, that we are kin, not just as a metaphor or in a sort of ecological connection, but literally kin. And of course, as a biologist, I'd say that kinship is about bloodlines, that I look at a tree and we are actually cousins to one another. But from a religious perspective, we're united in the same co-created family. And then contemplative traditions, in a way, sweep all of that aside and say, be still, stop asking questions, listen, see where the process of stillness and listening and presence will take you. And of course, there are ways in which some contemplative traditions are very much guided and bounded, and others that are more open-ended. And that's my hope as a teacher, is trying to create some of those spaces in my classrooms where the voices of other beings can be present. It's not just me and my syllabus or what we're reading in the book or even what the students are bringing to the classroom. All of those things are important. But to go in spaces on the street and on the woods, on a lawn somewhere, and actually listen to what's coming up from the grass and the trees and from the sky, to let those voices be present without judgment or predetermination of what those mean or what each of us will hear or sense. And I think that, in my view, that is a form of religious practice, but it does not fall within the structures of most religions as they're practiced in North America. And there is, I may be misunderstanding religious history, but there's always been a tension between institutional religion and the contemplatives, because the contemplatives are a threat in a way, because they're not so worried about the hierarchy or about the fundamental purpose of organized religion, which is self-preservation of the institution. Um, and so there's this notion of the center and then the edges. And we've got a lot of center power now, and we need more of the power and the listening and the troubling from the edges. And I think that's present within religious traditions and histories, but it's not manifesting in always in a very productive way now.
Yeah, these are all great reflections, and I guess I think about it as sort of like the reductive models that you find the reductionism in both science and religion, right? The reductive models that reduces things to just materiality or reduces things to their species borders, but then the religions that say humans are above nature and there's male and female and there's, you know, this is right and this is wrong and these purity type things. So these reductive forms of these reductive stories, right, I find are the worst ones for the planetary community, and what we need are more connective stories or something like this. I'd like to ask another question for all of you, because all of you brought up in some ways the stories that are told and untold, and the naming and unnaming, or the unnamed and the named, and any sort of re-narration or new meaning making practices or new constructions of worlds. Something does get left out. And then how do we deal with that which is left out? How do we stay open to what you were saying, the edges, right? In ways, what are practices that help us to stay open to the edges and the marginalized that will inevitably be a part of any co-construction of the world and its institutions and economic, legal, religious, so on and so forth. How do we remain open, recognizing that we always have to in some way collect ourselves to move forward, right? So if that makes any sense. And at some point we have to do the whole Martin Luther, here I stand, God help me, I can do no other, because we have to live in the world. But then how do we act ethically towards a future without sort of closing ourselves off to the things that are harmed by our co-constructions? I mean, anyone can start again.
Thank you for that question. I think about like the violence of fixed stories and the violence of institutionalized stories, like that we live inside of. We live in an institutionalized story of white supremacy and of patriarchy and of dominance over the earth, and that cosmology pervades everything, and it's an agreement that we live in, and it's an agreement that's hard to like not be a part of. And so I wonder in shaping news stories where there's room for more permeability, there's room for more queerness, there's not this like fixedness, and there's room for those stories to continually be reshaped and adaptive and evolve and be more like the earth. Then yeah, I think the way that we're living out story right now, which doesn't make room for that.
Thanks for that.
I think too, transdisciplinary work really offers ways to at least begin to approach and to start speaking outside of very fixed ways of approaching problems. You know, so I think if we can, for example, begin to understand that science, art, and spirituality are not necessarily in opposition to each other, that leaves room for people to address issues such as, you know, climate change or, you know, the erosion of beaches in a manner that takes into account the real science, the involved in restoration practices and ways that we can build those restoration practices in alliance with efforts to try to restore or preserve or recapture the spiritual benefits of seascapes. You know, I think that kind of like willingness on the part of people who, you know, who possess some knowledge, but not like no one possesses all knowledge. Let's you know, in the academy, like, I don't think people know how to really speak across these disciplines. I think it's really interesting that Alexis Pauline Gumbs, to date anyway, has really kept herself outside of the academy, although she herself is a PhD, so on and so forth. But it seems like sometimes academic spaces, because of the competition among various units or individuals to be seen as the possessor of knowledge, are really not good at speaking to each other or to speaking outside of academic communities. And I have hope that transcending those boundaries or bringing down those boundaries will move us in the right direction in terms of figuring out new ways to approach old problems, and finding new language to try to address them in a manner that really has an impact.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this need for what we've talked about some when counterpoint and other spaces to undiscipline the university, to think in an undisciplined way. Yeah. David.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo what Alex said, that just no wonder the world is so broken and fragmented when the institutions through which we train ourselves and I raise up our young people are massively fragmented. We even have divisions. We use the word, the division of arts and the division of science and so on. You know, and I know it's not necessarily a conscious intention in that way, but if we believe knowledge is so fragmented and that the people who are the knowledge seekers and the teachers can't even speak to one another, of course the world is going to be like in deep, deep trouble. But you know, do I know the answer? I don't. And I think the question you posed to us is one of the big questions of our time, is how, given that we're so interconnected, we have so much power, even just turning on the gas in a car, we're putting stuff in the atmosphere, we're having an effect on the other side of the world, we're drawing on oil wells from, you know, sometimes the other side of the world, sometimes, you know, just a few hundred miles away. We order food, we don't even know where it came from. Mostly it's hundreds of miles. We don't know the people whose hands pick that food and so forth. Order something from Amazon. I mean, the Amazon box arriving on the doorstep is the ultimate sort of the product of colonialism, if you like, that we are completely dissociated from the people, the land, the animals and plants, even the stores. Before, you know, you go to the grocery store and get your stuff, and now it just arrives where you have no sensory connection whatsoever to the stuff that we're bringing. And I use the word colonialism because that's in the context of global trade. We're building on that. Say, you buy furniture, usually it's coming from a tropical forest in maybe in Southeast Asia, say. And indigenous peoples are being driven off their land in order that we can have that furniture. In some cases, but in other cases, that furniture is actually helping people have a livelihood that is grounded in their local community and growing wood products in a very healthy, wholesome way. And we have no way of knowing. And so the answer, one part of the answer has to be, I think, sensory embodied reconnection and listening. So actually getting, and this doesn't, I mean, it feels absurd to say that getting your hands into the soil to grow a little bit of food, or actually interacting with neighbors a little more and so on. And of course, this is doubly challenging in the time of COVID and so forth, but just embodied, not just through our heads, but getting our bodies and senses back in relation so that we can feel and sense where there is beauty and brokenness and respond appropriately. Now, on an individual level, that's helpful. We need that to then ramp up at cultural levels because, of course, we're embedded in systems of power and so on, that individual actions are insufficient. We need to come together to solve those problems. But I do think if we're not rooting our senses back in relationship with the people and places that are sustaining us, we're going to have a very hard time finding right action.
Very, very good. All of this conversation. Let me invite each of you to ask to see if you have any questions for each other or a response to something the other said. So.
Thank you. I was really struck, Alex, and I want to make sure I heard this correctly. I was really struck by the language of anti-prayer. And that felt like there was something about retracing that gesture that I want to get out of my head of how, and out of my memory of seeing George Floyd's death and the posture of kneeling and the posture of prayer and how you frame that in this language of anti-prayer. And I wonder if you might just speak more to that.
Sure. So it's actually, and the word, as I was invoking that image that's seared into my memory, that's the word that came up. I do, you know, I was raised Catholic, and so, there's so much ritual involved in kneeling and standing and kneeling and standing. And I found that metaphysically, there's some relationship to that practice and yoga and other religious ceremonies that, prayer rituals that ask you to kneel, that kind of like open you up to contemplation, open up the spirit to contemplation. And in my mind, the officer kneeling on the neck of Floyd was the very antithesis of that. It was the snuffing out of life. Another phrase that that comes to mind is Saidiya Hartman's use of the terror of the mundane, the hand in the pocket, the casual way in which Floyd's life was snuffed out. But anti-prayer seems to me an even better way to describe exactly what was occurring. It's not a call to God to me. It was actually stepping in the place of God and making the decision that this person's life was no longer worth living, that his calls to his mother, the things that speak to all of us as human beings or should have, were just not acknowledged by that act. And so that's where that's why that word came to me. I'm sure that it's a word that can be used not only in those incidents where someone's literally kneeling, but in the act of snuffing out life, disregarding life and the worth of not only that person, but the people who are tied to that person and community.
Thank you.
Very good.
That language is that language is so supportive to just as a frame. So I'm so grateful. Thank you.
We do have a question from the audience, and it's the big question about capital C capitalism. Do you think we can solve this dissociation, animals, humans, nature, in the frame of capitalism? And I think, thank you for this question, Aida. I think, some people want to say, this is not the Anthropocene, this is the Capitalocene, right? And sort of to name sort of the inequalities, because it's not all humans have contributed to the destruction equally, and some humans have taken more benefits than others, and some have received more of the ecological and social brunt of this. So maybe we should call it the Capitalocene. But what do you think about this, the question of capitalism and the way in which it seems to keep integrating all of our attempts to go against it? Environmentalism becomes like, green, sexy, buy a $50,000 electric car, this sort of thing. So yeah, question of capitalism.
Well, I can start. I know that in your description of today's panel, you also asked us to think about new ways we can think of in terms of memorials and monuments, and one of the things that I started thinking about is I would love here in Miami to have a memorial that kind of captured the wade-in on the part of African Americans who wanted to desegregate, who wanted to have access to Virginia Key Beach, what has become known as Virginia Key Beach. And I started thinking about it and reading about it, and I thought, wow, wade in. I'm thinking in terms of wade in the water, and what kind of a monument that would invoke that spirit. And as I was reading it, I learned through Nathan Connolly's work, as well as Dr. I think Bush's work, that part of the impetus to start the Wade In was actually entrepreneurial. So there were African American entrepreneurs who wanted to kind of like make some money off of off of this endeavor. And the initial Wade In 1945, although it captures a nice story of pre-civil rights activism, also did not actually result in a desegregated beach. It resulted in the African American, a beach demarcated for African Americans. And so the story becomes more complicated, right? Because now you have Black capitalists involved. You have not necessarily the dismantling of segregation, but the the acquiescence to a certain extent, or kind of agreed upon distribution of potential sources of revenue. And so that's kind of like made me rethink the whole idea of like how to memorialize this, and how can we remember this while being honest about the historical record, being honest about capitalist interests as they find their ways into the narrative in ways that we're not always comfortable with. How do we position, how do we talk about Black pursuit for the right to relax, right? Or for the right to make money. We need to talk about that, right? Because people need to, these are things that we don't like to necessarily discuss fully in these kind of circles. But how do we incorporate that into the story in a manner that's honest and fresh? And in terms of like the possibility of building a memorial, Virginia Key Beach, I would love to see that happen in a way that also pays very close attention to sustainability, to the actual ecological conditions, a way that invites future research and ongoing research. And so dealing with all of that and thinking in terms of funders and capitalism and interests are things that we can't hide from. We have to face it, I think, forthrightly and be honest about the ways in which interests sometimes do not adhere to the stories that we want to tell.
Thank you. Brontë, do you have anything final you'd like to say on this issue, or?
Well, I love that vision, Alex, and I'd love to support if you want to bring it to life. I love thinking about what Free Egonfemi, a Black woman and performance artist, and multi-transdisciplinary artist, who is facilitating a project called RVA, Untold RVA, in Richmond, Virginia, and was a fellow of Monument Lab's work. She coined a term called commemorative justice, which I really love, thinking about how do we both commemorate that which has not been memorialized or in our public memory. And then I think a part of that justice is also being willing to hold our complexity so that our memories are not, so that, what Chedie Moraga says, that we might be informed by just political memory and be informed by our foremothers' footsteps and their work, and also the things that were problematic, and how we might be informed by their beauty and by the troubles. So my last statements around capitalism are, I think we have to, reconciliation to me happens at so many different timelines. There's holding a future perhaps wherein capitalism might be dissolved, and there might be something that is more accountable to our bioregions, to one another, to our relationships with place. that's closer, that's local, that's what David is speaking to, where you're connected to source and to what is near you, and that is what is reliable. But for right now, Black people need money. So I'm kind of like, what is our economic justice now that provides the space for that kind of imagination? And how do we simultaneously hold dispossessing ourselves of that being the only reconciliation for us? Grateful to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. David.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, those thoughts are just so powerful. And so capitalism, I mean, I think manifestly, the current system right now is not working. We are losing hundreds of thousands of acres of forest worldwide every year. Methane, carbon dioxide is spiking. We're in an extinction crisis. We're in a crisis of injustice within the human community. So at multiple levels, the way we're doing business now is failing us in the present moment, but also failing the future. So the people who are here 100, 200 years from now will not look back on our time with great gratitude for the economic system that we were embedded in. That being said, there are other systems that have also failed spectacularly. I mean, the Soviet Union was not a model of environmental justice or of lack of pollution and so forth. And I think from my perspective, one of the big questions is agency. Like, who is making the decisions about this particular patch of land? Or this, say in the context of forests, how are we going to manage this forest? Or in city planning, who decides where the highway is going to be routed and how we're going to arrange infrastructure and so forth? And again, that agency has been highly asymmetrically distributed or located in just literally in a handful of people's hands. New York City, for example, Robert Moses, a guy who sort of ran New York City planning for decades in the middle of the 20th century, is responsible for where the roads are now, why mostly only white neighborhoods have parks close to them, why particulate pollution is far higher in communities of color than in white neighborhoods. And so one person and the people who enabled him responsible for this legacy that the New York City is going to be living with for centuries. And so there was agency, the control of power over decision-making that affected local communities was like high up in this one locus rather than distributed on the ground. And of course, distributed is messy. People are going to disagree and change their minds and so forth. But the track record of humans who are given control over their land, and economists sometimes call this the commons, managing things on a local basis where people are sharing in reciprocity. The track record is far better than that for those methods of management than for top-down agency control power located in just one or a few individuals. And yet, within the disciplines of economics and ecology, there's this term, the tragedy of the commons, that when there's a so-called resource held in common, we just trash it. Well, there are certain circumstances in which that happens, but mostly the record has shown no. When people work together cooperatively and work out their tensions through conversation back and forth, the rivers have more life in them. The communities are more healthy and so forth. So part of the answer, I think, certain forms of capitalism and free market enterprise, I think, are not incompatible with justice or leaving the world a better place. In fact, they can even help that because it restores, in a way, agency back to individuals and communities. But other forms, when they're dissociated and power is located in just one or a few hands, are deeply problematic. So restoring agency to local communities, and in fact, I mean, in the US, we have a terrible record of doing this, but many other countries have done this, say with indigenous forest management, returning management and control of forests back to the communities that have lived in those forests for thousands of years, and far better record of sustainable and just management of forests in those cases.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. I want to. Unfortunately, we have time now for this portion of the day, and I just want to thank all of our panelists once again. It's been wonderful. I'd also like to remind you that at about 15 minutes until the hour, brontë will lead a workshop for those who remain on the call. So for the time being, during this little break, your cameras and microphones will be muted, but just stay on the call and they will be unmuted. And I don't know what you say, the video will not be unmuted, but the video will start again about 15 minutes before the hour. Let me just also end by saying another word of thanks to all of our sponsors and co-sponsors, the Pachiasana Institute, Counterpoint Navigating Knowledge, the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University, the Religious Studies Department at Florida International University, as well as the Department of English here at FIU. Again, these webinars have been free and open to the public, but if you feel so compelled and have the means and are able to do so, please feel free to send a donation along to one of these sponsoring organizations. In the meantime, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And join us in about 15 minutes before the hour for the workshop portion of today. Thank you.